The last goodbye. Returning to a town that no longer feels like home, I never thought I'd come back to this town. The air still smelled the same, a mix of pine, rain, and distant bonfires. The roads were just as cracked, the same potholes in the same places. Even the corner store on Maple Street, the one my father used to take me to for ice cream, still had the faded "buy one, get one free" sign taped to the window. Everything had stayed the same, except me. I gripped the steering wheel, my fingers digging into the worn leather as I sat in the hospital parking lot. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, an erratic rhythm fueled by anxiety and years of unresolved anger. I hadn't seen my father in 10 years. Not since the night I left, slamming the door behind me, vowing never to return. Now he was dying, and I was here, walking into the past. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, the kind of place where time stood still, where the walls absorbed grief and quiet goodbyes. I had spent my childhood dreading places like this. My mother used to volunteer at the local hospice, and I remembered sitting in the waiting area, watching families break apart in whispers and tears. Now I was one of them. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound against the linoleum floor. My chest tightened with each step. Room 306. I stopped, staring at the faded numbers on the door. I could still turn around, get back in my car and drive away, let my mother call me when it was over. But then I thought of her voice over the phone last week, the way it cracked under the weight of exhaustion and heartbreak. "He doesn't have much time, Claire. He asked for you." For the first time in a decade, he asked for me. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. A father reduced to a shadow. The man lying in the hospital bed was a stranger. He looked smaller, his once broad shoulders now sunken, his skin pale and paper-thin. Machines beeped beside him, a quiet but persistent reminder that life still clung to him, if only barely. He turned his head slightly at the sound of the door creaking open. His eyes, once sharp and filled with judgment, were dull and unfocused. For a moment, he just stared. Then recognition flickered. "Claire?" His voice was weak, fragile. I nodded, stepping inside, his lips pressed together like he was trying to form words, but didn't know where to start. "I didn't think you'd come," he finally said. I let out a small, bitter laugh. Neither did I. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, years of silence stretching like an ocean too vast to cross. I sat in the chair beside his bed, not because I wanted to, but because standing made me feel like I was on the verge of running. He exhaled, his breath rattling in his chest. "You look different." "So do you." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but it vanished just as quickly. "You cut your hair," he said after a pause. I reached up instinctively, brushing my fingers through the short strands. I had chopped it off 2 years ago, a symbolic shedding of my past. "I guess I did," I murmured. He nodded slowly, as if filing that information away, as if it meant something. Then silence again. I stared at the IV drip, watching the slow, steady flow of liquid into his veins. The machine beeped, a steady reminder of time slipping away. The weight of regret. I was wrong. The words were so soft I almost missed them. I turned to him, waiting, but he kept his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was making you strong." My throat tightened. "You didn't have to make me strong, Dad. You just had to love me." His eyes glistened, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Regret. "I pushed you away," he admitted, and by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. I wanted to stay angry. I wanted to tell him that an apology now, after all these years, didn't erase what he did. But what good would it do? The past couldn't be rewritten. I let out a slow breath and reached for his hand. He hesitated, then squeezed mine weakly. His skin was cold, fragile. "Did you ever miss me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His lips trembled. "Every day." The answer came so quickly, so effortlessly, that it took me off guard. I blinked rapidly, looking away. "I missed you too," I admitted. A tear slipped down my cheek. He reached up, his fingers shaking, and wiped it away. It was the first time he had touched me gently in years. And the last goodbye. 3 days later, he was gone. The funeral was small, a few distant relatives, some of his old friends, and my mother. The town pastor spoke about forgiveness and redemption, but I barely heard a word. I stood by his grave after everyone else had left, the wind biting at my skin. I thought closure would feel different. I thought it would be clean, like flipping a page in a book. But it wasn't. Forgiveness is never clean. It's messy. It's painful. It doesn't erase the past, it just makes it easier to carry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. A letter he had written to me. The nurse gave it to me after he passed. "Claire, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know I love you. I always have. I just didn't know how to show it. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough. You are and always will be my greatest pride. Dad." I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest. Then I placed a single white rose on his grave. "Goodbye, Dad. For the first time in 10 years, I finally let go. The road to healing weeks passed, but the weight of my father's words lingered. I carried his letter everywhere, folded neatly in my pocket, like a relic of a past I couldn't quite leave behind. At night, I would run my fingers over the creases, tracing each word as if doing so could rewrite the years we had lost. I stayed in town longer than I intended. At first, it was out of obligation, helping my mother sort through his belongings, making sure she wasn't drowning in grief alone. But soon it became something else. An invisible tether kept me there, a pull I couldn't ignore. One evening, I found myself parked outside the old corner store on Maple Street. The faded "buy one, get one free" sign was still taped to the window, slightly more tattered than before. I walked inside, the bell above the door chiming, the scent of old wood and melting ice cream filling the air. The place was nearly empty, save for an elderly man behind the counter. "Evening," he greeted, his voice familiar. "Mr. Thompson." He had worked here since I was a child. Back then, he had a full head of hair and a booming laugh. Now his face was lined with age, his hands slower as he wiped down the counter. "Claire?" His brows knitted together, recognition dawning. "Well, I'll be. Haven't seen you in years." I smiled, surprised he still remembered me. "Yeah, it's been a while." He studied me for a moment, then gestured toward the freezer. "Still partial to Rocky Road?" A chuckle escaped me. Some things don't change. He scooped out a generous portion and handed me the cone. "On the house. Your dad used to bring you here every Friday after school." I hesitated before taking it. "Yeah, he did." Mr. Thompson nodded knowingly. "He talked about you, you know." My grip on the cone tightened. "He did?" "All the time. Said you were the smartest kid he ever met. Stubborn, too." He chuckled. "Guess you got that from him." I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. My father had never been one to express pride openly. Hearing those words from someone else made my chest ache. The healing begins. That night, I sat on my childhood bed, the rocky road melting in my hands. My room was untouched, posters of bands I no longer listened to, books I had outgrown. A time capsule of the girl I used to be. I picked up my father's letter again, reading it for the 100th time. "You are and always will be my greatest pride." Maybe he had loved me all along. Maybe he just didn't know how to show it until it was too late. The next morning, I packed my bags. Not because I was running, but because I was ready to move forward. As I loaded my suitcase into the trunk, my mother stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. "You don't have to go," she said softly. I offered a small smile. "I think I do." She nodded, understanding. "Will you come back?" I thought about it. About the town, the memories, the past. Then I nodded. "Yeah, I think I will." As I drove away, I passed the cemetery one last time. Without thinking, I pulled over, walking to my father's grave. The white rose I had left was still there, petals slightly wilted from the wind. I kneeled, brushing the dirt from the headstone. "Hey, Dad," the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and rain. "I think I finally understand," I murmured, "and I think I forgive you." A weight lifted, not completely, but enough. I stood, taking one last look before heading back to my car. It was time to start over. A new beginning. I returned to the city, back to the life I had built for myself. But something had changed. The restlessness I had carried for years had dulled. I found myself lingering in moments I once rushed through. Morning coffee, late-night conversations with friends, the warmth of the sun on my face. One day, I found a small, handwritten note tucked inside my suitcase. My mother must have slipped it in before I left. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without pain. I pressed the note between my fingers, letting its meaning settle into me. I wasn't the same person who had driven into that town with resentment weighing me down. I had left a little lighter. Weeks turned into months. I focused on my work, reconnected with old friends, even started journaling again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. And then one afternoon, I found myself dialing a number I hadn't called in years. "Mum?" Her voice on the other end was surprised but warm. "Claire, I was thinking, maybe I'll come visit again soon." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I'd love that." As I ended the call, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe healing wasn't about one grand gesture. Maybe it was in the small choices, the decision to call, to visit, to let love in even when it hurt. The journey forward. Visiting home again wasn't as hard the second time. My mother and I sat on the porch, drinking iced tea, watching the world move slowly around us. We talked, not just about my father, but about everything. About her garden, about the neighbor's new dog, about the bookstore she always wanted to open but never did. One evening, I found myself at the cemetery again. This time, I didn't come with questions or regrets. I came with a sense of peace. I placed a fresh white rose on my father's grave and sat beside it for a long time, letting the silence fill the space between us. "I hope you're proud of me," I whispered. And for the first time, I believed that he was. Months later, I moved into a new apartment, one with big windows and a tiny balcony overflowing with potted plants. I took up painting again, something I had abandoned years ago. I reached out to friends I had lost touch with. Slowly, I let myself build a life that wasn't weighed down by the past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I wrote a letter to my father. I didn't plan on sending it anywhere. I just needed to write it. I told him about my life, my hopes, my fears. And at the end, I wrote the words I had never said out loud. "I love you, Dad. Always." I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a box along with his. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. As I looked out at the city lights, I smiled, knowing that this moment of quiet contentment was my true goodbye. The most peculiar, hilarious, and unbelievable stories are here. From absurd situations to tales that sound straight out of a movie, get ready for the wildest real-life stories. Subscribe now and get ready to laugh, be amazed, and say, "No way."